Let's take a few minutes and talk with sports historian, Georgia Tech professor, and author of the book Jumpman, The Making and Meaning of Michael Jordan, Johnny Smith. Johnny, congrats on the book and thanks for giving us some time to talk about it.
Oh, thanks so much. Glad to be here.
All right. So this book isn't really a biography. It's kind of about the making and the meaning of Michael Jordan. You're somebody who's written about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, somebody who's written about Muhammad Ali. Why did you decide to tell this version of Michael Jordan's story now?
Yeah, great question. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago in the 1980s and 1990s. Major Michael Jordan fan of Chicago Bulls. I was one of those kids who wanted to be like Mike. And so his career in many ways shaped my youth, like a lot of kids growing up in the Chicagoland area. Oh, okay, great.
I'm not from
And
Chicagoland, but he shaped my youth.
yeah, sure.
Except for the part where Jason jumps.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
he didn't have that type of influence on me. But I mean, I remember going to the Jordan Barkley games at the Spectrum when they battled in the playoffs in '90. And I mean, that's a memory that I have with my dad.
yeah, absolutely. And so I think, for me, he's always been a presence in my life. Well, fast forward, I became an academic historian, and as you said, I've written about several sports icons, many of them black athletes like Muhammad Ali and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and others. And for me as a historian, I've always been interested in how these famous black sports figures have shaped the black freedom struggle. How did race change the way that they saw their role in relation not just to sports but to American culture? So, as someone who grew up with Jordan being this great presence in my life, I thought, if you follow the works of a lot of journalists who've written about Jordan, or even you watch The Last Dance, race is not really at the forefront of the conversation. So, I wanted to better understand how race shaped the way that Jordan saw himself, how he presented himself in the public as an endorser for Nike and McDonald's and Chevrolet and Coca-Cola and these other companies, but also how race in the 1980s and 1990s shaped the way that we as the public, white Americans, black Americans, Americans of all different races and ethnicities saw Jordan. And I think there's a pivotal moment. The book follows this period between 1990 and 1991. And I think it's a crucial period in his life and career for two reasons. Number one, of course, that's the season the Bulls pursue their first championship. Jordan and the Bulls, they knock out Magic Johnson and the Lakers in the NBA Finals. It's the most watched NBA Finals in history up until that time. More than 70 countries are tuned in this satellite age. Hundreds of millions of people around the world are watching Jordan, and it's expanding the audience for MJ and for the NBA. And there's going to be consequences for him that I can talk about later. The other thing that's happening in 1991 after those finals is Gatorade launches the Be Like Mike Gatorade campaign. And if you watch that commercial closely, I think there's two crucial storylines that are emerging. You see Jordan surrounded by kids like us, white kids, black kids, boys and girls. And the commercial is positioning basketball as America's game, as the democratic sport that is inclusive, that brings all kinds of kids from backgrounds onto the court. And it's Jordan who brings them there. Jordan is positioned as this unifying force, the racial unifier. And in studying Jordan's career, particularly in this period, what I came to see is that many Americans saw him as this great American hero who supposedly transcended race. But what I argue in the book is that this is part of the Jordan mythology. This young man who grows up in the South, who is confronted with racism, is harassed by white kids who hurl the N-word at him, could never truly transcend race. In fact, it's just the opposite. His experiences that he encounters in the South shaped the way that he saw sports. He thought that sports was going to be the ticket to get out of the South, to get out of Wilmington in the late 1970s. He internalized these messages and thought that, well, sports is this one space where I won't be denied, that kids can't tell me that I'm less than or that I'm inferior because of the color of my skin. And so I wanted to explore that story, which is largely missing, I think, from the narratives that you see in The Last Dance.
So let's take a step back to 1984. You talk about in your book 1984 and the Olympics and how that brought Michael Jordan into our vision. Can you talk about how important the 1984 Olympics were to Michael Jordan and the Michael Jordan that we later come to know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the 84 Olympics were hosted here in the United States in Los Angeles, and it was celebrated as this great patriotic moment. Remember, this is the Cold War. It's the rivalry between the US and the Soviets, who refused to participate in the 84 Summer Games. And Jordan appears on the cover of Sports Illustrated. He is the face of Team USA. And it's his story that is seen as an American story. He is the grandson of sharecroppers. He comes from this middle class Southern Christian family. And so I think that imagery that is produced, that's the moment when he starts to be described by sports writers as an American hero. And I think that's interesting because he's not described as a Black American hero. He's being described as an American hero. And this is an age in which political pundits, particularly more conservative Americans in the age of Reagan, they emphasize this idea of color blindness, that race should not matter anymore. And even Jordan himself, as I write in the first chapter of the book, he embraces this idea. He tells reporters time and time again, I don't want people to think of Michael Jordan as a Black man. I want them to see him as a person. And he would say things like, I don't see you for your color. I see you as a person. Now, however well-intentioned color blindness may be, it is a problematic concept in the sense that the denial of race makes it a lot easier to deny racism. The denial of race makes it a lot easier for Jordan not to talk about race and not to remind people that he has had these experiences with racism that shape the way that he presents himself to the public. But of course, embracing color blindness, that's part of David Stern's vision as well for the NBA, because if you remember, from the late 70s to the early 1980s, critics would say that the league was quote unquote too Black, and the Black players were selfish and they were greedy in this age of free agency, and that there were these reports that they were using cocaine on just about every roster. Jordan tells the famous story that when he was a rookie in 1984, the team goes to an exhibition game in Peoria, Illinois, and he's looking for his teammates in the hotel, and he knocks on the door, and the door opens, and he sees the white lines on a table, and he sprints out of there because he doesn't want to get caught up in that scene. Well, a lot of folks, when he told that story in The Last Dance, they thought, oh, this is the first time he's telling the story. It's not true. In the late 80s, he told the story as part of the Just Say No campaign that was organized by the Reagan administration. And it was important because that was where Jordan is saying that I'm not like them, and this is my point, that racial transcendence is less about who you are than who you are not, right? He's positioning himself to be someone who is safe and non-threatening, and therefore that makes him someone who is who could be a role model, someone that you could look up to regardless if you're Black or white, because he was wholesome and he was a man of character, and those values mattered, particularly in the 1980s as the NBA is trying to rehabilitate its image.
I found it interesting that you noted that Jordan didn't differentiate, like he didn't want to focus on communities. It was just everybody should say no, not the Black community should say no. And that fit into this image that they were trying to sell. And you go into the role of David Falk doing that. He thought Jordan gained unbelievable exposure, but some of the stats were amazing. I think you had 5% of the league's 280 players were in national or TV print ads at the time. And the general feeling was they weren't marketable. Can you talk about Falk's approach where Nike was sort of the linchpin for that and pushing for the individual personality and the shoe line, which was different than the way that Black athletes had been marketed previously?
Yeah, the Nike deal is crucial, and you won't learn about this story in the motion picture Air, where we don't even see Michael's face. But David Falk, I think, was pretty sharp in understanding that he needed to sign a deal with Michael that was authentic. He always talked about authenticity, that it made the most sense for Jordan first to sign with a shoe manufacturer for a basketball shoe, because he was a basketball player. He's going to be selling basketball shoes. Same thing that he signs a deal with. I think it was Wilson was his basketball, the company that signed Jordan. Authenticity, that's the key. Now, when Falk is trying to land this deal, keep in mind that in the sneaker endorsement business, Converse really has the biggest stars under contract: Magic Johnson, Julius Erving, Larry Bird, Isaiah Thomas. But they're not really highlighting them in individual campaigns. They all wear the same shoe, just in different colorways. So there was not this effort to focus on a singular athlete. But Phil Knight looks at the numbers and what he's paying all sorts of NBA players just to wear Nike shoes. No campaigns around these guys, and he thinks there's no return for me. Why am I paying dozens of NBA players to wear Nike shoes? It's not helping us with sales. Nike is struggling financially. So there's a meeting of minds at Nike to build a campaign around a single individual. And the future of sports is going to be all about the cult of personality, building a movement around heroes. And I think that's what's really interesting about this period in the mid 80s, because Nike and Phil Knight and David Stern in the NBA, they have the same vision for marketing. They want to build their brands around individual heroes, creating heroes. And one of the things I tell my students about heroes, or cultural heroes, they serve a social function or a social purpose. And that is they're models to be emulated. And I think this is why our conversation around race is so important. In MJ, it's that, he becomes the template that if you want to land these endorsement deals, you can't be seen as militant. You can't be seen as outspoken. If you want to be a crossover star in the world of sports and entertainment, like an Eddie Murphy or a Whitney Houston or Bill Cosby during this era, well, you have to distance yourself then from these conversations. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that I mentioned in the book, there's very few Black sports agents. There was a perception that Black agents did not have access to corporate America. They couldn't land these deals. But David Falk was able to make this deal with Nike. Of course, it becomes an unprecedented deal. And then he's able to build on that. And he makes this case that to McDonald's and Coca-Cola and Chevrolet, that you three companies, you're going to benefit from Nike, because Nike's going to put Michael Jordan on television. He's going to be seen all across America, and you can draft off of that visibility. And so that enhances Jordan's marketability for those other companies who didn't have to take as much risk, since Nike was already carrying so much risk. But of course, in the end, it pays off for all of those companies. And for Falk, really what he likes about Coca-Cola and McDonald's in particular, and Nike, they're all companies that are exporting products overseas. And that's also something that's really important in understanding the Jordan phenomenon, is that the NBA and those companies, they're all becoming international. In the satellite age and in the cable age, they're going to be reaching more and more viewers from the late 80s into the early 90s.
One of the characters that was around Michael Jordan during his career is Jerry Krause, and you talked about the commonality that they found with each other, namely Jerry Krause experiencing anti-Semitism and Michael Jordan experiencing racism. Can you talk about that relationship, which also seems very complex?
Yeah, boy. The Krause story is fascinating to me. When I was researching his background, I learned that he had grown up in Chicago. He desperately wanted to become a somebody. He goes on to be a scout in both basketball and baseball, and eventually becomes general manager of the Bulls, hired by Jerry Reinsdorf at a time when the sports writers in Chicago, I thought, Jerry Krause, he had already been the GM actually once for the Bulls. People forget this, and it was a total disaster. But this is someone who I think was terribly insecure. And I think he was picked on as a kid, and he was picked on as an adult. He was always kind of seen by the beat writers as, like the unathletic kid who follows the jocks around the high school. And that kind of reputation followed him even when he's a grown adult as the general manager of the Bulls. And, when Krause would meet with potential draft picks or free agents, Black players, he would say, well, I can relate because I've experienced discrimination as a Jewish kid growing up in Chicago, which undoubtedly he did, experience anti-Semitism. However, one story that came up was a profile written by Rick Tellender in Sports Illustrated, where Krause is quoted basically saying that he experienced horrific anti-Semitism in his high school. Well, after some of his former classmates at his high school read this profile, Jewish classmates, they wrote a letter to the editor and said, Jerry Krause is exaggerating. As fellow Jews in our high school, we had very good relationships with other kids. There was not rampant anti-Semitism in our school. And it raises all these questions that I wish, we could ask Jerry Krause if he was with us today. Well, why exaggerate? No doubt that I'm sure he encountered anti-Semitism at some point, but where does that come from? And I suspect there's some trauma in his youth that never goes away. There's just this void he wants to fill. And he talks about how, he wants to win a championship for his dad. That's a really big thing for him. He's very connected to his father. So when Jordan comes to the Bulls and Krause is the GM, there's the famous story that in 1986, Jordan has the broken foot and he's ready to go. And so he's playing these exhibition games back in Chapel Hill with college players, and Krause finds out and he's, pissed. So there's this heated meeting between Krause and Reinsdorf on one side of the table and Jordan on the other side with David Falk. And at one point, Krause says to Jordan, you can't do whatever you want. You're Bulls property now. And when Jordan hears this, you're Bulls property now. You belong to us, these white executives. That crossed the line for Jordan, I think. And it was deeply offensive and insulting. And I try to contextualize that story to remind readers about the history of white executives in sports, exploiting African-American athletes. And that tension never really goes away, even though we have integration in the 50s and 60s, and we have these collective bargaining agreements, and Black players led by Oscar Robertson had secured free agency. There's still a tension there that you work for us. It's not a partnership. But the thing I want to point out about Jordan is that this was someone who was deeply driven to assert his independence. And I think we see that in a lot of ways. He's not going to listen to Jerry Krause. He's going to maintain autonomy over his body. He believes that he's going to control his destiny, and he asserts himself in that moment. And he never forgives Jerry Krause. As we all know, Jordan will hang on to slights, real or imagined, forever. And he hangs on to that one. And so I think it's important for readers to understand, again, that there's this underlying racial tension there, I think, between Krause and Jordan that hasn't been fully acknowledged.
Earlier in the interview, you mentioned the time between 90 and 91 and the growth with Be Like Mike campaign and the finals, dueling with Magic. He also had to deal with some social and political ramifications in that time. SI ran the cover on the sneaker murders in inner cities. He was asked to endorse in the North Carolina Senate race. Can you talk about his struggle in that time period to just keep being looked at as a person as opposed to a Black person when it came to these circumstances?
Yeah, I think, for all the statements about him transcending race, we find that in these two stories that you're raising here, that's not really possible for Michael Jordan. In 1990, even before Sports Illustrated runs the cover story, Your Sneakers or Your Life, with someone holding a gun and grabbing these Air Jordan sneakers, the New York Post, Phil Mushnick, was a columnist, wrote this story about how Spike Lee and Michael Jordan were responsible for marketing in their Nike commercials directly to inner city Black kids who couldn't afford these Air Jordan sneakers. And they were to blame for all these supposed muggings and killings over Nike shoes. And it's really a fascinating story to think about on a number of levels, I think. The first question that comes to my mind as a historian is, okay, is this true? Were there all these muggings taking place? Okay, what's the evidence for this? So two things I did in trying to recreate this moment and doing my research. One is I used several newspaper databases and did comprehensive searches looking for as many articles as I could to document this supposed epidemic. And I couldn't find it. I couldn't find evidence that confirmed what Mushnick was telling his readers. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't any muggings over sneakers in the cities and starter jackets. Undoubtedly, there were cases, and they occurred. We know some occurred in the inner city. But the other problem I found is that Richard Lapchick, who at that time was the director of the Sports and Society Institute at Northeastern University, he was asked this question in 1990. How many of these so-called sneaker murders have there been? And he found between 1983 and 1990, only 8 cases where there was a murder linked to a sneaker robbery. And so this gives me pause to think about, okay, well, why the exaggeration? Why the hysteria? Well, I think we have to understand what else is going on in inner cities at that time. There is this growing fear of this supposed phenomenon of black on black crime, and that the inner cities are out of control. And there's these black youths who are running these violent gangs. And the latest thing that they want, it's not cars, it's these Air Jordan sneakers that have become these valuable totems of status. And so Jordan gets crossed up in this. He's asked about it. He's unprepared to deal with it. He doesn't know what to say. There's a legitimate case that he hears about where, in fact, in Maryland, a black teenager, shot and killed another teenager and took his shoes. And that's the one that's featured in the Sports Illustrated story. But there's this incredible hysteria that takes place. And Jordan, I think, realizes that it's not enough for him just to set examples and be the role model. That's not going to be enough. He's going to have to really think about these issues that are happening in society. But the reality is he doesn't want to deal with them. Later that summer in 1990, Jesse Jackson, who at that time was the head of a civil rights group in Chicago, Jordan's hometown, called Operation Push. Well, Jesse Jackson organized a boycott of Nike, saying, look, Nike has all these black endorsers like Michael Jordan and Bo Jackson, but they don't have many black executives. They don't have black vice presidents, and they don't advertise in black magazines like Ebony and Jet or broadcast on BET. So Michael, you need to join us and push for change. Michael doesn't want any part of that either. And so in the summer of 1990, he basically stops talking about these issues. He goes abroad on this Nike tour with Sonny Vaccaro, and he puts on these basketball exhibitions for troops serving in Europe. And I think, he really just hoped that this would go away. And by the time he shows up again in the public, it's the preseason for the Bulls in 1990. And that sort of becomes what he does. He retreats into himself. He's not comfortable in this role. Same thing with the Harvey Gantt. His mom wanted him to campaign for Gantt, donate to Gantt's election campaign in North Carolina. Jordan refuses. And I think, it's easy to say that Jordan was simply protecting his brand. Some people will make that argument, but I actually think that there's more to it than that. I think that Jordan saw himself as part of a generation that didn't prioritize protests. That for him, his mindset was, my job is to make breakthroughs in other spaces, namely corporate America. And if I can break through in corporate America and set good examples and defy these stereotypes, well, then I'm contributing to racial progress in that way. And I think that was his mentality, that he's focusing on certain aspirations and shattering barriers in different ways. Being a voice, being a leader, he says, that's not who I am. In fact, in 1992, after the LA uprising, the protests and the riots that take place there in response to the LAPD officers being exonerated for beating Rodney King, Jordan is asked about this, and he says, I'm not a leader. This is not something for me to talk about. Magic Johnson wasn't saying anything either. Black stars in that time, they did not see themselves as voices for social change. That was not their role, at least not the role they embraced.
Look, we could talk to you all day, but we also know how busy you are because of how popular this book is. So I'm going to ask you a two-part question, and we only have about a minute left so you can get to your next interview. Um, the role of the Medal of Freedom in Michael Jordan's life and culminating. What did that mean? And the last big question is to
Hmm.
you, having written the book and done the studies, what's bigger, Michael Jordan, the person, the player, or the brand?
Okay. All right. So I'll try to answer these concisely, which I'm not good at. The medal from Barack Obama, you can see what it means to him because it moves him to tears. It's an incredible moment. And if you hear how Jordan is introduced, it's about how he affected cultural change. And what's interesting is that Barack Obama gave the Medal of Freedom to two black basketball players. I think Kareem was in the same year as Jordan. You have to double check, but I know Obama also gave one to Kareem. But when he describes Kareem, he talks about how Kareem was a social conscience of America, that he took these important stands. So Barack Obama chooses these two basketball legends, gives them the Medal of Freedom for very different reasons. Two men who represent very different eras. And of course, Kareem was one of those critics of Michael for being silent when it came to racism. So it's a really fascinating story that I try to explore sort of the relationship between Jordan and Obama in the epilogue. And of course, remember too, Obama has arrived in Chicago when Jordan has arrived in Chicago. And so Chicago is really a defining place for both of them.
Yeah, Obama
Um,
couldn't afford the tickets to go to the Bulls game. So,
yeah.
he kind
Yeah.
of
I
grew
mean,
up watching him. And then it
yeah,
comes full
right.
circle. He's giving him the Medal of Freedom at the White House.
I know it's a great story. It's a fantastic story. And of course, Obama, of course, is a basketball enthusiast. It's a big part of his life. And the way that he saw race through basketball, that the basketball court in Hawaii, where he grew up, was a place where he felt like he belonged, that his skin color wouldn't matter. I digress. To your other question, um, I would say the brand is more important than Jordan the person today. And here's why I would say that. You look around the world, the Jumpman logo is still everywhere. You go to China, you go to parts of Europe, uh, the Jumpman logo, people are still buying Air Jordans and Jumpman brand gear and apparel. But I don't think that there's this clamoring still to see Michael Jordan or to hear from Michael Jordan. And we're not going to get that. That brand is what allowed him to build enormous wealth, to become the first NBA player turned owner, who just sold his team, his majority stake of the Charlotte Hornets, for an estimated $3 billion. I think the brand, more than the man, made that. Because the man doesn't really give us a whole lot of himself. That's the mystique that I talk about in the book. And if you watch The Last Dance, he doesn't want to let us into his private world. We don't learn about, what it was like in his home when he's playing for the Bulls. We don't see Juanita. We don't see his kids. We see his dad, of course, and his mom in the early part of the story. But, he doesn't let us into his private space. And Air, the motion picture Air, it reinforces that theme. He's not even in the movie. We just get the back of his head.
That's
You can't tell me that's not also intentional.
how you know the brand is big, that you don't even have to show the guy. You just show the back of his head and
Exactly.
makes for a movie. The book is Jumpman, the making and meaning of Michael Jordan. You should get it. You absolutely will not regret it. Johnny, thanks so much for the time and best of luck with the book.
Oh, great to meet you both. I really enjoyed talking to you.